and I'm one of the trustees of AFINet, and I bring apologies from Gallus Bischoff, who is the chair of AFINet and who normally chairs these webinars, but his teaching timetable has come out for this semester, and Tuesday afternoons are now suddenly impossible for him. So such is life. So AFINet is Addiction and the Family International Network, and we exist to bring together practitioners and researchers and policymakers and experts by experience who are all interested in or involved in the effects that someone's problematic use of alcohol or drugs or gambling has on other members of the family and on other people close to them. We've more than 500 members from more than 45 countries across the world, and you can learn more about AFINet from our website. And if you're not already a member, you can join for free by completing the application form on the website. Among the things that AFINet does are our conferences and our webinar series. We held our last conference online because of COVID, as was the one before that, just 6 weeks ago in September 2022. And the programme and recordings of all of the presentations, and indeed all of the presentations from the previous online conference held in 2021, all of those are on our website. Our next conference will be an in-person one, which we're very excited about. This will be our first in-person AFINet conference since 2018, which we held in the UK. Our next one will be in Rotterdam in Holland on the 15th to the 17th of June 2023. A call for abstracts will be going out soon, and we hope to see all of you and many, many others in person at last in June in Rotterdam. The webinar that we're going to hear today is part of our webinar series. The webinars are free, but as a small charity with no other funding sources, donations from people who attend the webinars are always welcome. Again, details of how you can make a donation are on the website. And the technical side of these webinars, running the video conferencing systems and making the recordings and so on, are undertaken by two of our colleagues in Finland. What an international group we are. Two of our colleagues in Finland who work for the AFINet Foundation, Emmi Kaupila and Sari Javansu. So a huge thank you to both of you who I know are already on this call as well. The webinar series has been running since October 2020, and like the conferences, all of the presentations are also online on our website if people want to catch up on the wide range of excellent and fascinating presentations we've had from all over the world, from Australia and New Zealand, through Indonesia and Malaysia, through many European countries, and from Canada, the USA, Brazil. And today's webinar comes from Canada, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Oona St-Amant. I hope I pronounced that in some way. That's not too bad, Oona. Oona is an associate professor at the Daphne Cockwell School of Nursing at Toronto Metropolitan University. Her programme of research examines the various intersections of unpaid care work, including family caregiving and substance use disorder. She tells me that she uses an array of critical qualitative research methodologies to enact social change. And today she's going to talk to us about mothers' experiences of caregiving for their adult children with substance use disorder. She'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for people to ask questions and for us to have a discussion. As the talk progresses, please write any questions in the chat function, and Oona will then answer them at the end. Or at the end, simply put your hand up, and there's a little hand sign under reactions in Teams. And if that doesn't work for you, then just get my attention at the end when I say, has anyone got any questions? So, and now over to you, Oona.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share screen now. Hopefully this goes as planned. Are you able to see that? I'm sorry, yes. I can't see.
No, wonderful. I know. One of the wonderful things about Teams is that you can't see what we can see. I don't know why Teams do it like that. But anyway, we can now see it.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Well, thank you. And hello, everyone. I really appreciate this opportunity today. And thank you all for attending this session. I'm extremely pleased to be sharing some of the knowledge that I've acquired related to family caregiving and addiction. As Professor Velman noted, my program of research examines unpaid care work, and my interests are really in family caregiving, double duty caregiving, and even volunteer work. I've done a few previous studies related to home-based dementia care and family caregiving, and I was especially interested in the visibility of care work and how care is socially constructed. As many of you probably know, family caregiving in the field of gerontology has really accelerated in the past few decades. While it took a lot of time and a collective of health, social, and gerontological professionals to advocate, lobby, and advance research, family caregivers in dementia care are finally rather ubiquitously referred to as care partners in Canada. And rightly so, there are resources like home-based respite care, temporary long-term care placements, and skill building resources for caregivers that use family-centered approaches to care for persons living with dementia. What's interesting is that, although there's a lot of opportunity for improvement still, this field has really paved the path for family caregiving. And yet it has also illuminated how not all family care work is equally resourced. Terms like respite and inpatient care remain unfathomable to many families, especially families struggling with addiction. So hopefully through collective efforts like this, like what AFINet does, we can all contribute to the betterment of resources for families. I'd like to start off by acknowledging some colleagues. This work doesn't happen in a vacuum, and I'm very grateful to my colleagues who've educated me and continue to collaborate on various projects. I'd especially like to recognize a Canadian community group called Families for Addiction Recovery, with Angie and Louise at the helm. I continue to marvel at their efforts, and they've been a large part of my understanding of family care work. So the goals for today's discussion are to illuminate problematic perspectives on families that have contributed to stigmatizing conceptualizations about the family and that remain in popular discourse and clinical practice today. I hope to talk to you about the actual caregiving experience for many family members based on the literature, and also share with you some findings from a small study I did with mothers of adult children with addiction. And finally, I hope to engage with all of you in some discussion about pathways forward. So the addiction landscape in Canada is such that approximately 21% of the population will meet the criteria for addiction in their lifetime. This was a 2015 study. In the province of Ontario in particular, it's estimated that 10% of the population uses substance problematically. 13.6% of Canadians are considered high-risk drinkers, and alcohol is the most common substance for which people meet the criteria for addiction at 18%. Like many countries, there's a strong growing trend of harms related to opioids, and people with mental illness are twice as likely to have a substance use disorder compared to the general population. Persons living with substance use disorder have a high risk of premature death. It's estimated that around 67,000 deaths per year are attributable to substance use in Canada. And this includes 47,000 related to tobacco, 15,000 related to alcohol. And a study that was done between January 2016 and September 2019 found 14,700 opioid-related deaths in Canada. Just to give you some context, our population is around 37 million. 1 in 7 hospitalizations and 1/3 of all days in hospital involve a patient with mental illness. By and large, in Canada, there is consensus that families should be involved in care for their relatives with substance use disorder. Leading institutes in Canada, like the Canadian Mental Health Association, acknowledge that family members play an important role in reducing hospitalization, reducing relapses, and reducing the involvement with criminal justice. And families are also important players in improving rates of recovery for their relatives with substance use disorder. In fact, there's been several calls to action to better support families. And yet there seems to be a disconnect between the rhetoric around supporting the family and actual practice, particularly at the front lines. While there are limited or unavailable data, what we know from other mental health caregivers is that families are overwhelmed with their caregiving duties. A recent study that was published in August this year found that family caregivers for persons with addiction have difficulty regulating distress and depression symptoms, partially because of internalized stigma they experience and their own caregiving burden. Corrigan's work from 2006 also still holds relevance in terms of blame and shame towards families that lead to social avoidance, which includes accessing resources to support them as caregivers. Another challenge in Canada is that there simply are not recent data related to the living conditions, and in particular, persons with substance use disorder who live in a family setting. A study from 1996, which is quite dated, revealed that the vast majority of persons with substance use disorder live in a family setting. And this is incredibly important to know. This is valuable to note, particularly in terms of public health responses. Many resources in Canada are downstream and only activated after the family has dissolved and or the person with substance use disorder is without a house. Supporting families early is urgently needed, and as such, families need to be a part of government responses. So I'm going to start by discussing some of the problematic historical literature that has contributed to stigma towards families. I am really focusing on those studies that have been problematic. There are an array of studies that were not problematic at the time and were designed to support families. But for this part of the presentation, I really want to hone in on those that have contributed to negative images of family related to addiction. I feel that it's important to identify the origin of stigmatizing conceptualizations of family. And not unlike how mothers of children with autism have had to overcome labels like refrigerator mother, parents of children with substance use disorder have also been blamed and shamed for their role in addiction. Emergent from the literature were critiques of parents like they're too self-obsessed, inept parents influence addictive tendencies and behaviors in their children. At the time, there was a pursuit to unearth the root cause or etiology of addiction, and as such, family studies were largely focused on parental maladaptive behaviors within the family system. But it's important to note that despite seemingly objective proclamations, much of this literature is fraught with substantive methodological and study design limitations. Some issues include a small sample size, study only from the perspective of the person with substance use disorder, lack of information related to the study recruitment, participation, methods, ethical conduct, narrow population, a lack of observation of family interactions. So I will review some of the early recurrent conceptualizations of family and how these ideas have contributed to stigmatizing notions of family today. This is not to suggest that there are not cases of abuse and trauma caused by family members, as this continues and should be a part of our response. However, we also need to reframe how family is theorized and as a way to promote family inclusion moving forward, as not all families are abusive. So the 1970s, several studies from this era and earlier were characterized by prototypical parents of persons with substance use disorder. For example, in Stanton's work in 1978, he conducted a research study in Philadelphia and described the overprotective, indulgent mother when it comes to the addicted child, and even favoring that child over others, while fathers were characterized as uninvolved, weak, and distant. Welsh in the 1970s studied the dyadic relationship of persons who use heroin at Haight-Ashbury, however, only from the perspective of persons with substance use disorder, and concluded that mothers tended to be silent, masochistic figures, while fathers were inept, passive-aggressive, or absent. These notions were confirmed and cited in 11 other studies. Indeed, in Blockman's paper entitled Conventional Wisdom About Familial Contributions to Substance Use, the authors describe two common theories pervading the therapeutic practice assumed about families and addiction. One being that persons with substance use disorder tended to be from a broken home, and two, have an overprotective mother. The broken home convention suggested that children were more susceptible to substance abuse, if there was disruption in the nuclear family that led to a parent being absent. Bluckman went on to dispel some of these myths about families and mothers in particular. The second stipulation was that mothers of persons with substance use disorder were more likely to be overprotective and indulge their neuroses, which inhibited proper development of the child, rendering them vulnerable to addiction later in life. A paper by Wolk and Deskind, which were from the perspective of parole officers, stated unconsciously the mother does not want him, that is the person with substance use disorder, to develop a sense of responsibility because that would take him out of the infancy stage. Notable from this era were these harsh characterizations of mothers and fathers of children with substance use disorder that lacked empathy for the parental perspective, including the parents' own history of trauma, and instead placed blame on parents for their children's addiction with little acknowledgement of the historical context, including the cultural role of drugs and alcohol at the time. Although these studies were largely correlational designs, conclusions by the authors betoken causation. Furthermore, while some of these studies collected demographic data, they were largely decontextualized from the socio-political environment. They didn't take into account socioeconomic status, race, age, or education. And so this body of work ignited a lot of stigma towards families as the cause of addiction. The 1980s gave rise to both confirmatory work of early family conceptualization and scholars who challenged generalizations made about families. By way of confirmation, a study by Kaufman and Kaufman examined by means of subjective observations videotaped sessions of mothers interacting with their child with substance use disorder. After reviewing the tapes, the authors supposedly made objective claims that 88% of mothers were overly enmeshed with their child with substance use. The authors went on to conclude that frequently the crisis created by drug-dependent members is the only way the family gets together and attempts to solve problems. Mother enmeshment and indulgence were commonly used terms that were particularly hurtful, as they implied reward or gain for the mother's loyalty to their child, because why else would they support their child with addiction? Interestingly, addiction was not the only illness to blame at this time for mother enmeshment. Indeed, mother enmeshment was also cited as being the primary family pattern related to schizophrenia, quote, on male homosexuality, unquote, childhood asthma, school phobias, and depression. So under the medical gaze, mothers were considered the source of illness and to blame for many social woes. This narrow focus on mothers conveniently absolved policymakers of responsibility for available supply of alcohol and drugs, and also reinforced neoliberal ideology whereby health is a choice and outcome of a productive family system. We know better in many cases today. Obviously, it would be considered a quantum leap to blame asthma or sexual orientation on mother enmeshment. However, with addiction, there seems to be remnants of these views. Other work from this era looked at family dynamics, such as parental expectations on children. A study from Yale in 1984 examined the perceived marital and family environment of opioid users and supported some of the previous description of persons with substance use disorders' perceived family environment while challenging other notions. For example, the authors describe parents of children with substance use as providing little preparation for social roles while expecting high achievements. However, the authors acknowledged that 70% of the study participants described the relationship with their parents as satisfactory and warm rather than cold. The 1990s era shifted from parental roles to parental surveillance. An important study from the National Institute of Drug Abuse suggested that parental surveillance and parent-child conflicts were strong predictors of substance use onset. Several authors described inadequate fulfillment of the parental role in terms of monitoring and communication with children, and concluded that addiction was more likely the result of parental surveillance than specific parent-parental dynamics, overindulgence or absenteeism like from the 1970s. Although this literature was an extension of the original work whereby parents were the source of blame for their child's addiction. Some attention was given to this era to peer groups and exposure to substance through friends. However, several studies looked at family as the reason why the child went to the peer group in the first place, often resulted when there was a lack of parental supervision. This era also gave rise to dichotomous concepts of family function, whereby family was either functional or dysfunctional, and functionality pervades today. The literature from this era continued to seek out ways to emphasize familial behaviors with substance use disorder. This isn't to suggest that we shouldn't look at familial behaviors, but the attachment of blame and shame becomes problematic. Some attention was given to parental substance use disorder and close family members with addiction. By and large, however, this literature emphasized parental failures to watch their kids for signs of addiction in adolescence. Emergent from this time was also ways to prevent addiction predicated on monitoring children. And remiss from these suggestions were attention to the socio-political context, whether parents could even afford to monitor their children, what role education played, systemic racism, and other social determinants of health. Furthermore, similar to earlier work, the goal of these studies was to establish a correlation relationship between parental behavior and addiction, extending the theoretical assumption that addiction is largely malleable by parental influence. But we need to think about why this was the root of inquiry. More current perspectives and recent literature has looked at the link between unfavorable emotional relationship with parents, and especially the father, established throughout childhood and adolescence, and addiction. A 2021 study compared persons with substance use disorder to a control group and found an imbalanced emotional perception of parents during childhood and adolescence. 87% perceived their mothers in a positive manner, tolerant and full of understanding, while fathers were viewed negatively. The same study also described a negative correlation between family functioning of the individuals with drug addiction and their relapse tendencies, meaning that family discord was a predictor of relapse. Traumatic experiences witnessed in early childhood have also emerged in more recent decades. That separation from parents has been noted as a significant source of childhood anxiety that can lead to the onset of substance use disorder. And more focus has been put on addiction prevention. What's important to note is that it's really difficult to access treatment if you feel you are to blame for someone's illness. And although rhetorically we know that families can play a helpful role in addiction, this is an enormous barrier to overcome. And these labels are hurtful terms in both popular discourse and at times in clinical practice. So now I'm going to segue from the historical discourse to look at a more recent scoping review that I completed, and it looks at what some of the actual experiences are like for families. And again, the previous work was focused on what has been problematic in sort of laying the seed for stigma. And now it's important to think about, well, what are families actually going through? So this was a scoping review that looked at over 1,200 articles. We narrowed it down ultimately to 21, and the emergent themes were as listed on the slide. I will review each of these themes with you now, but just briefly. So disruption in everyday life refers to everyday family life becomes significantly altered for many families and centered around the person with addiction, as reported in 86% of the studies examined. Several authors highlight how family events and rituals often revolve around the person with substance use disorder and discuss the stress experienced by family members. Part of the daily disruption in life was managing stigma. As one participant highlights and quote, "People just don't understand." This disruption in everyday life furthers their social isolation as they are unable to engage regularly with friends and other family members, and families report being unable to experience joy in many cases. The cycle refers to caregivers, how they describe experiencing a cycle of care work with periods of repetitive intensity, uncertainty, and fear that come with chaotic substance use. Family caregivers reported losing agency and control of their own emotional state when their experiences paralleled the cycle of chaotic use of the person with substance use disorder. Ambivalence excuse me, vacillate, excuse me. My apologies. Families vacillated between anger, resentment, and a desire for avoidance, and a sense of love, compassion, and care for their relatives. They often experience their emotions paradoxically and are conflicted at times, even immobilized by uncertainty. Social blame, self-blame, and vicarious stigma. Caregivers routinely and often simultaneously experience social blame, self-blame, and vicarious stigma. Social blame makes families feel isolated, disgraced, and humiliated, and this theme was identified in more than half of the studies that we reviewed. Families also describe carrying the blame for their relatives' behavior and being perceived by the wider community as bad parents. These feelings often superseded their self-understanding as loving and caring parents. And this was true also for the study I had done with mothers, which I'll explain shortly. In several of the studies we examined, family members described taking on various unwanted roles to care for their relatives. One of these roles came in the form of enforcing legal justice. For example, one parent explained in a study, "I tried to make him accountable, and I would take him to the police station with his stolen stuff." Finally, the last theme that emerged is that sadly, many people with substance use disorder lose their social networks, including family and friends, and often family caregivers are the ones who remain in contact with the person living with substance use disorder. They become the be-all and end-all for that person, and this often involves taking on many caregiving roles, which can be overwhelming for the caregiver. So moving into the study, looking at mothers' experiences, this was a small study that I did, but very rich. I used a critical feminist theoretical framework and interpretive descriptive study design. I don't know if it's just nursing, but this is a popular methodological design in terms of very pragmatically looking at the so what, why should we care about this information? And what are the implications that providers in particular should be aware of. The interviews were done via Zoom because it was during the pandemic, and I also used an arts-informed activity with the participants. So the participants were Kamala, who had a son in his mid-30s, and Shira, who had a daughter in her early 40s. So these were the themes that had emerged, and I'll review each of these themes individually with you. So longing for wellness, the mothers in the study longed for a return to who their children were before being afflicted with mental illness and substance use disorder. They often attach their children's identity to the perceived potential, who they could have been or who they were as children. They didn't have very unrealistic views or expectations, or even an expectation for a return to normal, as they put it in their children. They really merely wanted day-to-day wellness for their child. So basic wishes like being employed, attending their children's activities, or in this case, grandchildren, and doing laundry. Wellness did not necessarily mean abstinence. It simply meant a reduction in all the risks that come with problematic substance use. In other words, risk to self and others, abuse, criminal offenses. As this was difficult, accepting their child where they were at counters many family therapy narratives, and we had these discussions during the interviews. In fact, some refer to this as enabling, when the parent promotes anything but an abstinence model. Something interesting that I've had many discussions with FAR about is that, when a parent is the one to accept any substance use, it's called enabling. When public health allows it, it's called harm reduction. And so we need to think about how family, how there's this double standard for families, and how we can move towards a model that is accepting of families. Another narrative often espoused in the therapeutic context is the notion of hitting rock bottom and merely waiting out addiction for some tipping point. And we see this in many family programs, that there will be, something needs to happen and everything will turn around. But this is not a realistic message to send. And addiction is not a waiting game. In this case, Shira, she longed for one precipitating event that would change the addictive pattern. And when she said very tearfully, "What is this kid's bottom? What is it?" And so holding out hope for this one, terrible event that could turn things around it continues to pervade today. Another theme identified from the study was identifying as a loving mother. So it was very challenging for both participants to reconcile their perceptions of themselves as loving mothers with the shame and guilt that they carried for their children, even though both mothers described deep love and affection for their children and daily caregiving. In both cases, the participants provided ongoing support to their children. In Shira's case, she even adopted her daughter's children and cared for them. So through an arts-informed activity, Shira used Scrabble pieces to describe her situation. And she reorganized the letters from mother to rot, something that represented a positive and loving view to a distortion that exists in her reality and how she saw herself as a parent. Another theme that emerged was loss. So both mothers in this study agonized over the loss of who their child was or who their child could have been, and the precariousness of their current existence. Shira grieved the loss of the relationship with her daughter and described a mutual broken heart, and not behooved by the hurt that her daughter also felt. Anticipatory grief was another theme that emerged through our interviews. And so compounding the mother's grief experience was this constant fear or anticipation of loss of their child. Shira in particular storied how every time a delivery person or stranger approached her front door, she worried it would be someone coming to tell her that her daughter is dead. Camilla also described anticipatory grief of her son when she said, "I'm afraid that today might be the day that he dies because that's on the table. I've been ready for this for many years. On many levels, I accept it as a potential, even likely outcome. It's very preoccupying because I love my son. I worry about his safety and his life. There is no joy for me. There is no recognition for the experiences that I have, that I've lost my son and all the hopes that I have for his future. I'm barely surviving." And these are very powerful words to describe this anticipatory grief. The mothers in this study also felt blame and shame. Camilla references social perceptions of blame that are associated with substance use disorder. And underlying these social assumptions of substance use disorder is the idea that someone is to blame for the disease. Camilla says, "Others think this could never happen to me. I thought that once too, but it did. My beautiful boy, creative, smart, and funny." In both cases, it was interesting because the recruitment for this study was through a newspaper ad. And so, I think they were very aware of their self as a caregiver, and they identified as a caregiver, as this was a criteria for inclusion. And yet neither were attending support groups. And in both cases, they had attended different groups, but felt it was not for them in one way or another. So Kamala says, "I've tried different support groups over the years, but have not found success. I think everybody's experience is different. I found everybody talked about being codependent. In my opinion, that's an unnecessary and hurtful word. I know I'm totally sucked into my son's situation, and I could use help in separating myself from him with reasonable boundaries." But ultimately, that barrier prevented her from seeking that help. Kamala notes her experience of accessing supports for herself and the subtext of blame that comes with the term, codependent. So in other words, some type of reward or something in it for her in doing this caring work. And conversely, their health suffered. Perspectives of family as a source of codependency or have pervaded the literature and dominate family-oriented interventions today. In this study, Camilla stopped attending support groups and seeking this for herself because it was not appropriate for her. So moving into some of the discussion points, and hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion after this presentation, is that families need support and stigma needs to be addressed. So we need community-based approaches to evaluate how parents are theorized in health service delivery. Parents are still subjected to value judgments when seeking care for themselves and their children. As healthcare providers, and I'm speaking from a nursing lens, we need to recognize how entrenched mother blaming is in our everyday biomedical discourse and make a conscious effort not to reinforce it. We need to develop therapeutic approaches inclusive of family that recognize the laborious and extensive role that mothers can play in caring for their children with addiction. Such strategies could include communication techniques. We use this term in nursing a lot, and I'm sure other professions as well, but it's unconditional positive regard towards a service user. And so also therapeutic supports that merely attempt to correct, presume unsupportive parenting styles as a means to govern children's substance use may interrupt some of the behaviors, but does not address family healing. Targeted interventions that support coping, address grief, and actively dismantle stigma and stigmatizing discourse needs to be done for families living with substance use disorder as a collective. This would involve active collaboration with family members and persons with substance use disorder. It would also entail using approaches and narratives that explicitly avert stigma and blame. Other implications for enhancing family care work. So mother blaming rhetoric continues to pervade in policy in the public policy realm today. In their discourse analysis of public policy, Devney from 2017 found that families were considered resistant and part of the problem. Underlying public policies are presumed ideals about family, including the idea that families should take moral responsibility for their relatives and carrying out care for their dependents. This perception of families that they have a duty to transform their relative with substance use disorder into a productive member of neoliberal society, and that any failures at achieving this obligation is deemed as an ineptitude on their behalf, is problematic. In terms, families are expected to become self-governing subjects who assume responsibility for their relatives' health as opposed to care partners. Public policy that problematizes family does not work, especially when the bulk of care for many people living with addiction is provided by family members. And I think it's very problematic that we don't have these figures as well, and we don't know how many people are living at home with this and how many families are managing this in the home. Their active inclusion and participation in public health discourse is required to move forward towards a family-centered care approach. Family-centered care emphasizes family as a holistic entity and a unit of care. A family system approach to nursing draws the clinician's attention to the collective experience of health within the family. This type of approach facilitates the recognition of mothers as both autonomous and interconnected beings within the social setting, and aiding with understanding of self and other. Because women are perceived as primary caregivers, they're often deemed responsible when trauma or abuse occurs. So in this case, good mothers are presumed to know what's occurring with their children at all times. And the nursing literature reinforces that mothers are responsible for instances of abuse, but assigning that culpability, or worse, assuming that the mother is to blame, compounds the isolation, and that doesn't help for supporting the family network. Ultimately, these experiences happen underground or away from the gaze of service. And so it's a major barrier to addressing substance use disorder at a systemic level and access to care for persons with substance use disorder and their families. attributions of blame further propagate these barriers. So more research on families is urgently needed to overcome this stigma. Skills building is only part of the equation. It's an important part. Parents need resources to enhance their communication and skills with managing, but there needs to be more to bring their voice into the public arena as well. Family voice and policy and practice is imperative. Families are systemically excluded from participating in care. Many policies and privacy restrictions, exclusion from health decisions, exclusion from systemic models of care in response to substance use disorder, and yet they are the ones providing the bulk of care in many of these situations. Policy and practice in other realms of caregiving, families are referred to as care partners, and yet addiction, this is rarely the case. So we need to think about why that is. Why are we seeing advancements in family participation in some illness realms and not others? And what is to blame for that? Access to support and resources start with recognition, and families are limited in their capacity to provide care, mainly because of a lack of resources. So breaking down some of the stigma against families is part of the direction forward. That is actually the end of my presentation for now. I'm hoping that we can have a discussion to move forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Oona. And if you would like to stop sharing your screen, we can start to see more people as well. That was a really lovely romp through both the historical approaches, which have been so family blaming, and a wide range of ideas as to what we need to do about it. Are there questions? I have lots, but I don't want to hog, as I often do, even when Gallus is chairing. So if there are any questions, please put your hand up in reactions, or so we've got something from Angie. Angie, do you want to come on and say something, or do you just want me to read that out?
Sure, I'll come on and say, I don't know how to turn it. Oh, there's my video. Hang on. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I mean, Oona is one of our volunteers. I'm with Families for Addiction Recovery, and I know how wonderful Oona is, but this is actually the first time I've heard her speak on this. It just, as a family caregiver, really was very validating. It's everything that I need to hear and don't hear from anyone else other than we provide peer support for families. So, you know, I know I've got my finger on the pulse of how family caregivers feel because of our peer support and also being a family member. And this just really isn't talked about very much at all within healthcare. And so I'm just glad to see this work. I thought the presentation was excellent. And yeah, as I said, very validating for family caregivers, and helps us understand, I think, what's going on, like why this is happening.
Thank you, Angie.
Yes, indeed. I'll say thank you, Angie, as well, and suggest if you wanted to join AFINet, you'll find a lot of other people who are coming from a very similar place. I mean, I think what you had to say, Oona, really resonated with the views of very many people in AFINet. So it's very refreshing and very nice to hear that coming out of work you're doing in Canada. Although there are other people in Canada as well. If you look at on the membership list of the people in Canada, you'll see that there are quite a lot of people from Canada, and many of them have similar sets of views. I'm interested in a lot of things while waiting for other questions. I mean, the first thing is that I recognize a huge number of the themes that you drew from your own work, from the work that I and others have been doing over the years as well. Anticipatory grief, loss, guilt over being a loving mother, and how one is meant to feel wrong about trying to support one's children because there's some theoretical views which suggest you should do something very different, being blamed, and obviously internalizing that blame and self-blaming, being excluded from services. I was interested that you talked an awful lot. I know you came from a feminist perspective, but you talked an awful lot about mother blaming, and some of your earlier stuff, when you were looking at the historical stuff, had a lot of father blaming in as well. I noticed you didn't mention anything about the evil fathers in this situation, only the inefficient and ineffective mothers.
Yes, and thank you for that. It is important to show that this, the work, a lot of the work has, especially from the scoping review, has paved the path for this mother study. That's why it really came first. And, even your work on ambivalence and thinking, those themes really were the springboard into this mother study. The reason I, made conclusions about mothers was because they were the participants in the study. But you are absolutely right that fathers have it just as bad in terms of, being a source of blame. And, often they're the cause of any kind of family disruption. What I noted in a few more recent studies too is that there's some awareness of mother blaming being out there. And so there's a little bit of correction for that, but fathers are still to blame in even more recent work as cold or unempathetic to addiction. And so these types of labels and stigma towards fathers also need to be overcome. And, caregiving in general, it's generally considered gendered care work, and it's considered something that it's mostly women who participate in. But I think we need to really think about inclusion of fathers and men and acknowledging their work, which is even less visible. And that might, I think there's various reasons for that. And part of it might just be their willingness to participate in this kind of research or talk about this type of care work. But it really does need to be talked about. And it's an important strategy for including both parents in this. You're absolutely right.
I want to come back to you on that, but I see Doug is coming in. So Doug, over to you. You need to unmute though. You're
Sorry.
not on. Oh, yeah, you are now. Great.
That's good. Richard, thanks for your comments. Oona, excellent presentation. I'm also part of Families for Addiction Recovery in Canada with Angie and Oona. And I lament the fact that the focus continues to be on the mother in this. Not that it shouldn't be, it should, but the dad should be equally. We have organizations in Canada called, one is the huge organization that deals with prevention of drunk driving, is Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. MAD, and it just annoys me it's called that. It's also a big organization in Canada that deals with kids that die because of substance use disorders, called Moms Stop the Harm. Like, where are the dads? Like, how it infuriates me. And it's just and we continue this prejudicial thing against fathers, that they don't care, and they're the ones that are judgmental, and they're the ones that cause harm from that root. And there's a whole prejudice and stigma on that front as well. And I don't mean to say this to take anything away from mothers' roles and the stigma against mothers, but it's very frustrating going forward.
I mean, if I can come in about this, I think part of the issue is that there's a whole area of stigma and stigmatization. And one of the problems with stigmatizing ways of thinking about things is that they get internalized, so that people self-stigmatize them because that's what's replete across society. So we have stigmatizing ways of viewing parenting experiences, where it's mothers who are meant, because lots of soap operas have told us this over the years, to take more of a responsibility, and we have stigmatizing views about the over-loving mother and the distant father, and so people sometimes follow these stereotypes that as they are revealed to them in media and in everything that they do. So that comes in, as you mentioned, Oona, about how difficult it is to do research on dads. Certainly over the years in my group, we've been doing research on family members in many countries over a very long period of time. And there is a massive preponderance of women who we recruit. And that's not because we don't try very, very hard to recruit men, but it's very difficult because, again, men are stereotypically people who are not meant to be in touch with their feelings and who would rather go down to the pub and talk about football rather than talk about anything meaningful. And people then follow that behavior because that's what they're schooled to do. So it's very difficult. We're talking about trying to change some very major ways of thinking, which people internalize themselves as well.
Yeah.
Yes. It's hard to reconcile, this very gendered, socially gendered work that is care work, and how men identify with that and how they take responsibility for it, and through in terms of participating in research and things, that's them acknowledging that they're doing this kind of work, which is a social stigma in of itself, as you're saying. And so that becomes an added challenge. So they have almost this double layer of stigma where, they're parents of children with addiction, and on top of it, they're men who are doing this very important care work.
Ellie, can I ask you if you could come in here, because you've written that you found very similar themes emerging.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I did some work with some qualitative work with spouses and partners of substance misusers, and found very similar themes. In fact, the kind of role dynamics around kind of a partner taking on a parental role was quite common. And so similar themes around kind of loss, kind of that anticipatory grief, that kind of feeling that you might get a knock on the door at any time, and that would be it. But also this kind of loss of sense of self. And I think you were kind of saying similar things about the kind of mother's identity being enmeshed in this kind of thing called substance misuse, and it being quite consuming. Have I got the right end of the stick there?
Yes, it's less of an enmeshment, but there's an internal struggle with their identity as a loving mother, because they're socially told they're not. And so they're trying to reconcile this perception that they're the ones to blame for their children's addiction with the fact that they're doing all of this care work. They're loving their kids to the extent that it's, that they can. They're caring for their grandkids. They're, in Kamala's case, she was bringing her son food every day, doing his laundry, all of these care tasks that, I think get taken up as either enabling or something else. Meanwhile, if her son had dementia, or if her son had another illness, she would be valued as a caregiver in a totally different way. She would be seen as a very loving mother. But because of the nature of the illness, she had to reconcile this fact that she's doing all of this with the social perception that she's done something wrong. So I think it sounds just like what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think there also, with spouses and partners, what I found, there was a stigma over being someone's carer because you're both adults. It's supposed to be a bit more mutual. So there was this kind of perspective that they were living a double life. These really kind of powerful women and men, actually, that had quite high-powered jobs, some within the legal system, were actually, managing and maintaining that life perfectly well, but behind closed doors, they were perhaps facilitating, buying drugs or supplying alcohol, and perhaps even engaging in illegal activities as well. So there was this kind of idea of, you know, the actual I'm a carer, and that's stigmatized, and it kind of reinforced that stigma, and kept them kind of leading these very kind of double standard lives that had quite a lot of caused quite a lot of inattention.
Yes, yes, yeah, that it sounds very resonant. Yes, thank you.
I mean, this whole thing about in one of the approaches that my colleagues and I have developed over the years, which is the 5-step method of trying to help people who are affected family members, absolutely looks at people's behavior, but it does so very much from a non-blaming perspective. And the model is that we recognize that family members have to cope in very, very different ways, and people do absolutely the best that they can, and often they don't know what the best thing to do is. And one of the things that people, family members, often come for help when they do come for help is saying, what should I do? What is the best way of dealing with this? And although some perspectives have very clear ideas about what the best way is, our approach is very much to say, well, it's hugely different depending on the circumstances, and that the best way of you dealing with this situation may be different for you than it is for somebody else, and also you may deal with it differently at different times depending on the context. So what we try and do is actually help people think through the different ways that they might cope, and what the advantages and disadvantages of those different ways might be, and to almost practice trying to cope in different ways, so that when situations come up, they feel that they have a range of possible responses, rather than feeling that they have no alternative but to behave in the way that they do, in which they recognize may not be the most helpful way, but they don't know what else to do. So it's enabling people in the proper sense of the term, rather than the derogatory sense that people use enabling. It's enabling people to feel a bit more empowered in a situation when normally they feel incredibly disempowered.
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Do we have more comments and questions from people? Judith, you're muted still, Judith. Actually, Judith, although the mute button's gone off, I still can't hear you. No, there's no sound coming through. That's a nuisance. I wanted to hear what you had to say. Oh. No. Oh, mute button's gone on, and the camera seems to have gone off as well, Judith. While Judith is sorting out her, she gave a very, very interesting talk at the last, not this last AFINet conference, but the one before that, about mothers dealing with children, adult children. So very similar to your work. So I was very interested in what she had to say. Judith, you're back. Your camera's back. How about sound? Nope, can't hear a word, unfortunately. That's really a pity. I can just mention that Judith is just starting to run to do a webinar series on this and related topics, which for AFINet members, we sent something round about it only a couple of days ago, and there will be something on the website, the AFINet website, about it. So there's a plug for your work, Judith, but not unfortunately hearing what you've got to say. If you wrote, maybe there's something in chat. It's something. Nope, it's Angie having to leave. Okay. I'm interested. Can I ask you a methodological question, Oona?
Yes.
So you presented a a detailed qualitative analysis from 2 participants, and I wondered what you thought the difference, if any, was between a small sample qualitative analysis and presenting case studies.
Yes. Well, in case studies, well, you could call it a case study, depending on the analysis technique you use after. So in this case, because I was interested in more thematic and presenting, you know, the actual practical implications from the study, that was the methodology that I had chosen. It's also, I should have mentioned that we had done 3, 2-hour in-depth interviews throughout with each participant. So it was, very long discussions and very immersive type of interviews. And so those really help to have that, co-creation of knowledge, or that idea that we can, it wasn't a rigid script that we followed. It was a very sort of immersive, letting the participant lead the discussion. So it was the combination of those kind of methodological decisions that led to that that methodological approach and that choice.
Yeah. I'm very familiar with these very in-depth and very long interviews from my work years ago on what happens to the children of people with alcohol problems once they grow up to adulthood, where we interviewed in great depth more than 150 young people between the ages of 16 and 35. The average time of interview was 8 hours, I think, and the longest interview was I think something like 16. We did allow toilet breaks.
That's important.
But no, these were done over a number of sessions, of course. So I understand what the richness of the data you get from these things. You mentioned the scoping review. Did I understand you to say that you had done the scoping review?
Yes, and so those results are submitted for publication now. So I'm happy to share that once it gets published. But it was a scoping review that we had done during the pandemic.
Right. I thought that I hadn't come across it, and you didn't refer to it in your paper. But the names of the authors are different. You said
for the scoping review.
Askey and O'Malley, I thought you said.
Those are, sorry, that's the framework for the scoping review that I used.
Oh, I see.
Yes, because we could have done Prisma, but because we were very interested in qualitative studies, the Askey and O'Malley was the framework that we selected. And we also had a stage in the scoping review, forgive me, where we went back to a number of community stakeholders to have them review the findings to validate it further. Excuse me.
Yeah. Right, I understand. Okay, well, when you do get the Eileen has got to go as well. When you do get that published, I would very much like to receive a copy of it, please, and then I can tell other people about it as well.
Wonderful. I will for sure. Yes. I think Judith posted a comment in the chat.
Thank you. Right. Okay. So I'll read it out so you can respond to it. Judith, I wanted to talk more about the issue of focusing on just mothers. On the one hand, those of USA who focus just on mothers are rightfully moving the conversation away from an incorrect gender-neutral view of caregiving. But to blame the researchers or organisers for keeping men out seems unfair. But I agree with Richard that we need to do further specific research, but feminist researchers should not be faulted for exploring the work of primary female maternal caregivers of their adult children.
Yes, I think she makes a wonderful point too. It's not, I think men have this, especially dads who are involved in their children's care work. I think it's incredibly important that their voice is heard. But we can't neglect that there is, a larger, gendered approach to thinking about this, and that women do a lot of the care work. And so I think, you know, recognizing that as well is important. And I think her comment is really valid as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I agree too. Okay. We've got Paula. Yes, please, Paula.
Hi. I would just like to ask a question regarding the research when you were talking to the mothers. And I just wanted to ask, were any of these mothers in recovery themselves?
No, actually, and it just so happened that in these particular cases, they were not in recovery themselves.
Okay.
Yes.
Can I ask why you asked that, Paula?
I work as a facilitator for a treatment center, aftercare treatment center. So I come across parents, not all of them, you know, in the group would be parents, but a lot of them are parents, specifically mothers, who struggle with parenting, you know, when they're, and it has gone on to lead to relapse because they don't know how to deal with their children that have gone into substance misuse. So, like, in my experience, I'm actually working with mothers in recovery
Who themselves also have children who have got substance problems.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oona, do you want to comment on that?
I don't think that's uncommon. I think that one of the groups that I had many discussions with out here, that is very common at for a lot of the parents to be struggling as well. It wasn't the case for this particular work, so it's difficult to make the same assessment. But I think you know, as
the stigma's bad anyway. That, you know, when you're dealing, you know, with a family environment, when you've got a child with substance misuse, but when you're in recovery yourself, the stigma, the blame, you know, the self-loathing, you know, I come across that all of the time.
Yes, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Okay, and I just see that Guinevere and Coma from Ghana has just just said hello. So very nice to see you, Guinevere. Guinevere's a relatively new member who joined us from Ghana. I think our first from Ghana in Africa. Okay, I'm going to draw this to a close if I can, because a few people have left, and it's now an hour and 10 minutes after we started. So I think that's a good time for us to stop. So can I thank you, Oona, very much indeed for both a really interesting and, as Eileen said before she signed off, excellent and well-organized presentation, and also generating a very nice discussion here within AFINet. The recording of this and the PowerPoint slides will be on the website by the end of the week, so you can tell other people that if they've missed it, they can still watch it and hear both the presentation and the discussion. Our next webinar is on Tuesday the 13th of December at 2 o'clock UK time, which is 3 o'clock Italy time. And I'll let you work out the times in the various other places across the world. Daniela Capitanucci and Maria Anna Donati from Italy are going to talk to us about affected family members of disordered gamblers during the COVID-19 pandemic in Italy during lockdown. From next calendar year, we're going to move to webinars every second month. And so the first one in 2023 will be in February, on the 16th of February. We're also moving days, so it's not the same day every single time. Originally, we thought that keeping it to the same day, a Tuesday, usually the 2nd or the 3rd of every month, would mean people could keep it in their diaries quite easily. But what we found was that that totally excluded everybody who had a commitment on a Tuesday every month. And so that meant we lost a lot of people. So we're going to move it around so that different people will be able to come at different times. So this is going to be on Thursday, the 16th of February. And Anders Hammarberg and Ola Holm from Sweden are going to talk about the important randomized controlled trial they undertook in Sweden of CRAFT, which is a very important way of working with family members and people with substance or gambling problems, working with CRAFT and an additional parent training intervention delivered online. So they're going to be talking about the results of their randomized controlled trial of CRAFT and parent training. So finally, a last reminder about the AFINet conference in Rotterdam in Holland, 15th to 17th of June. Look out for our call for abstracts and further information about registration. And a final thank you very much indeed again to Oona for a really interesting and well presented talk and a very, very interesting discussion which that generated. And for those of you who aren't members of AFINet, I look forward to seeing your applications. And to seeing you all next month.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Oona. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.